All right, in our last video for this section, we're going to be talking about bureaucracy, these large organizations that many of us find ourselves hopelessly stuck within in our everyday lives, and many of the issues around it. So the root word here is a bureau, which means an office or department for transacting a particular business, according to Merriam-Webster. And this should really kind of tell you everything you almost need to know here. A bureaucracy is an organizational structure made up of different offices, and this organization is meant to officially get to a specific end. So a school, as an example, is a particular organization. Every school has different bureaus or offices that have particular assignments for a particular business that work together to achieve the education of students. And the idea is that if every office does their job, it's the most efficient way to get everyone doing it. So you don't have your professor sorting out your financial aid. You don't have the IT person counseling students who are having emotional trauma. Most of our days these days are spent bouncing around these organizations. If you want to call about your cable service, you get to spend a lot of time on a phone menu. This is a bureau that has been turned into an automated service. And they will ask you a bunch of questions to try to get you to the right office. Press X to talk to someone in accounting, someone in marketing, if you want to change your service. And there's different offices, different bureaus for each of those things on the menu. If you want to update your driver's license, you can't go to the Department of Corrections, you have to go to the Department of Motor Vehicles. So governments are a great example of this. All right, so the ideal typical bureaucracy, or the kind of the pure form of bureaucracy, has a particular characteristics that we can identify. One is that we just described is that it's divided into particular jobs with people specializing in those jobs filling them. So everything that's done within the bureaucracy has a particular specialist doing it or an office dedicated to it. So this is what we call a division of work or division of a labor. And the idea is that people filling those positions should have the technical skills, the education to do it. So if you think about when you start a semester at school, you have to go to the financial aid office. And there you see the financial aid people. You have the registrar's office who register you for classes. You have advisors who oversee your courses. These are all different offices where people specialize in those different tasks. Usually the larger the university, the more specialized this becomes. So we see at smaller schools like Payne, there's a bit more overlap. People are wearing a number of different hats sometimes. Importantly, this should be full-time and paid so that people don't have secondary jobs. They devote their attention to the particular labor they do in a particular office. You want the person who is counseling you, if you're experiencing emotional distress, to be paid to do that and to be skilled in it, not to just be like some guy like me who, that's not my job. I don't know how to do it. So you probably don't want me doing it. There should be a clear authoritative hierarchy, as we see over here. This helps keep both individuals' jobs and what the individual does and doesn't do very clear. I know what my job is, and I know whose job it is to oversee that. This also means that if there's an issue, we know who to go to if I'm not doing my job. So these authority hierarchies need to be very clearly outlined, and if you go look at your student manual, you'll find those rules are written out very clearly. And this is why we have formal written rules and regulations. These rules provide a kind of a democratizing force there, a common set of rules for everyone. We don't just make them up. And often changing rules and regulations can be a very formal and long process. Basically, you have to go through many particular committees and authorities. But this means that people aren't just making stuff up and everybody has the same rules. And if everyone has the same rules and behaves in the appropriate way in their little office, then everything should run smoothly. And if you're not sure what to do, you go refer to those rules. It's written down. How should I dress? Why, it's right there in the dress code. And as with any secondary group, bureaucracies have impersonal or formal relations, meaning that we're not supposed to get involved or be too chummy with people. This helps keep the other aspects of this bureaucracy in place, that people work as efficiently as possible, and that we don't let our personal relationships get in the way of judging others' work, of the authority hierarchy. And ideally, if all of these work together, it's the most efficient way to get you towards that goal. If I start spending a lot of my time counseling students, then I'm not spending a lot of time on my teaching. Also, I might be totally screwing those students up, and then they're going to have less time towards their learning because I'm trying to emotionally counsel them and I'm not supposed to. So if everybody does their special job, it should hopefully get us all towards that end goal of educating you as students. Does it always work that way? No. But ideally, in this ideal type, it should. So one of the things we see resulting from bureaucracies dominating our everyday lives is what we call rationalization. And this is the slow creep through which these kind of bureaucratic organizations and bureaucratic type thinking and feeling start to dominate every aspect of our lives. This means that increasingly we're connected to others by those secondary relationships, and our lives are primarily caught up in secondary groups. So this is the minimization of long-term emotional relationships. We are increasingly interacting with larger bureaucratic organizations. And increasingly more of our lives is driven by a means-ends efficiency calculus. So we can see this in the rise of dating softwares, the kind of rationalization of love, or in hookup apps, which is the rationalization of sex. Sexual relations are increasingly based on how efficiently you can get precisely what you want, and by impersonal relations, right? The rationalization of sexual behavior. Other problems we see with bureaucracies is that they typically develop informal substructures, meaning cliques and groups within the organizations tend to have alternative or other goals than the larger organization. And goal displacement is also a large one, where the bureaucracy simply being a bureaucracy tends to lose sight of the goal of efficiently keeping people healthy or of educating students. So when my dad was in the hospital with a hip infection, you had all these different specialists. You had his pain doctor, you had his wound doctor, you had his hip doctor, you had his heart doctor. And if each person had probably read his chart and communicated with each other, then they could have gone towards getting him healthy. But nobody read his chart and communicated with each other. And so they're all in their little silos doing their little things. And in that process, then the organization starts to spin out and nobody could figure out really properly what was wrong with them. We experience this a lot in big organizations like schools. The doing of bureaucracy, of filling out forms and getting it through the appropriate people, gets in the way of actually trying to get students into classes or get students educated. Many of you may have had experiences like this that we can talk about in class. As we become increasingly wrapped up in specific special jobs, we can become alienated from our work. It's something outside of us that isn't really a part of us. And they can tend to be very anti-democratic. People should be put in jobs because they're highly qualified, not because people say they want them in that particular job. And when this comes into clash with government organizations and public representation, we can see some tensions between having someone who's technically specially qualified and democratically elected leadership. All right, lastly, we'll think about in-groups and out-groups, but we'll talk about this more in class. But We'll think about how and why we draw these lines and why they're so important to us and how we identify.